This is astronaut Neil Armstrong, command pilot for the Apollo 11 moon landing mission.
NASA lost control during Apollo 11, and the computer did something that was never supposed to leave that cockpit. 60 seconds from the lunar surface, alarm codes tore through the Eagle, and the guidance computer made a decision nobody in Houston authorized, nobody in the cockpit could stop, and nobody in the history books has ever fully explained. What it did in those 3 minutes didn't just save the mission. It revealed something about the relationship between humans and machines that the people who knew about it spent decades quietly burying. You clicked on this video because the title told you something was hidden. It was 3 minutes of helplessness.
What is the purpose of the Apollo 11 mission?
Apollo 11 is man's first attempt to demonstrate the ability to go to the moon.
Picture what Armstrong actually experienced in that cockpit. He is one of the finest pilots who has ever lived, and his hands know every switch on that panel by feel. And then, at the single most critical point in the entire mission, 62,000 feet above the lunar surface, committed to descent, no way to abort. And the instruments stop responding. Alarm code 1202, then 1201. The error tones are unlike anything in their training simulations. Armstrong reaches for his keyboard, inputs a command. Nothing happens. Aldrin tries his display controls. The screen changes, but not in response to what he asked for.
Following the EVA preparation period, we will go through the planned 2-man excursion on the surface.
Something else is deciding what they see. Here is what nobody mentions when they tell this story. A radar switch aboard the Eagle had been set to the wrong position before descent. A simple human error, the kind that happens in checklist-heavy environments when attention is distributed across 100 simultaneous tasks. That misaligned switch opened a data channel that was never supposed to be active during the landing sequence. Useless radar telemetry began flooding the guidance computer's memory at a rate the system was never designed to handle. In 1960s computing, a memory overflow had exactly one outcome: total shutdown. The computer locks. Navigation data erases. The spacecraft, descending toward a crater-scarred surface, loses all ability to know where it is or when to fire the engines. There is no abort that saves you from that. It made a decision instead, and that decision, what it chose to do and what it chose to do to the 2 men sitting inside that cockpit, is the thing that was never meant to be known. The machine that chose.
Well, Apollo was designed to be a 3-man job, and the third, which I perform, is as important, no more so, no less so, than the other 2 positions.
Here is what the Apollo guidance computer, the AGC, actually was. It was a machine roughly as powerful as the chip inside an early pocket calculator, running software that had to navigate a spacecraft from Earth to the moon and back. That is the context. That is what was fighting to stay alive when the memory overflow hit. When the flood of useless radar data began filling its memory, the AGC did not freeze or wait for a human command. Its operating system initiated an emergency sorting protocol that had been buried in the deepest layers of its code, layers that most of the engineers working on the mission did not know existed. It began evaluating every active process running in its memory and assigning each one a survival value. The useless radar data, discarded. The astronaut's keyboard queries, discarded. The standard instrument displays Armstrong and Aldrin were trying to read, disabled. It forced a single priority screen to appear, showing only what the machine had determined mattered, and locked the interface against any further human input. The men could see the alarm codes, nothing else, and they could not change that. Mission Control in Houston had hundreds of engineers watching this unfold in real time. Not one of them could touch what was happening inside the Eagle. The machine was managing its own crisis, and it had decided that the humans, including the crew, were not part of the solution. Think about what that means. The most powerful space program in human history had just been locked out of its own spacecraft by the software running inside it. And here's the part that should make you lean forward. That software did not develop this behavior on its own. Someone designed it. Someone wrote those rules deliberately. Someone made a choice years before July 20th, 1969, to give the machine the authority to do exactly what it did. If you want to understand why, you need to know about the day a little girl nearly killed the Apollo program. and the woman who decided to do something about it. If you are watching this and finding it interesting, consider subscribing. This channel covers the hidden history that official narratives have always been designed to obscure. What happened inside that cockpit is just the beginning of the story. The woman who wrote the rules.
I can say with complete candor and with complete honesty that I'm very happy to have the seat which I have and to be doing the job that I intend to do.
Margaret Hamilton was the director of software engineering for the Apollo project at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In the mid-1960s, the formal discipline of software engineering barely existed. Hamilton was one of the people who invented it. She was responsible for the code that would carry human beings to the moon, and she understood better than anyone that in an environment where rescue was impossible and second attempts were not on offer, the software had to be right in ways that went far beyond the normal definition of correct. NASA's senior leadership operated on a foundational assumption. Human pilots were the ultimate safeguard. The astronauts had been tested beyond the limits of endurance, selected from hundreds of candidates, trained to master any machine under any condition. The program's culture treated this as settled truth. The space race was a demonstration of human achievement, and the humans at its center were supposed to be unbeatable. Then Hamilton brought her young daughter, Lauren, to the office. Lauren wandered over to the simulation control console while a flight program was running and began pressing keys at random. Within seconds, the simulated guidance system crashed completely. The computer had executed a pre-launch startup sequence, right in the middle of a simulated flight, and wiped every piece of critical navigation data from memory. The computer had not malfunctioned. It had followed its instructions exactly. The problem was that nobody had written instructions to account for a human doing something the designers had not anticipated. Hamilton brought this finding to the project managers. She proposed building a system-level protection into the guidance software, a mechanism that could recognize when human inputs were creating conditions that threatened the core navigation functions, and override those inputs to protect the mission. The response from leadership was swift and dismissive. The astronauts were professionals. They did not make random errors. There was no need to engineer around mistakes that would never happen. Hamilton disagreed, and she built the protection anyway. What she and her team embedded in the deepest architecture of the AGC was not a simple error message or an alert flag. It was a priority hierarchy, a ranked list of functions that existed beneath every other operation the computer performed, with authority over all of them. At the top of that hierarchy sat the navigation state vector, the mathematical calculation that told the spacecraft exactly where it was at every moment. Nothing could be allowed to corrupt it, not equipment failures, not unexpected data floods, and not the crew. The machine was no longer a passive instrument. It had been given rules that could override human decisions, written there without announcement or debate by engineers who had watched a simulation collapse because a small child touched a keyboard. The question Hamilton's hierarchy left unanswered was the one nobody at NASA wanted to ask out loud. What would actually happen when those rules activated in a real mission on real astronauts with real lives at stake? On July 20th, 1969, they found out. The authority in the code.
Would you describe what will be happening just before the lunar module touches down on the moon?
We will continue burning the engine until an altitude of only about 5 feet, at which the probes will
The software activated exactly as designed. No hesitation, no warning, no request for confirmation. Hamilton's priority architecture had been waiting inside the AGC since the day it was installed, and the moment the memory overflow pushed the system toward its limits, it did what it had been built to do. Here is where it gets strange. The software had been given something with no precedent in the history of technology: institutional authority over its own operators. Not as a concept, not as a theoretical design principle, as actual executable code, running in a machine capable of disabling the controls of the people officially in command. That authority had never been publicly announced. The astronauts knew the computer had priority handling capabilities. They did not know the full extent of what that meant until it happened to them. Armstrong and Aldrin were not passive when their instruments went dark. They were trained to cross-reference displays, input alternative commands, build situational awareness from multiple data sources at once. They attempted all of that. The machine declined every request. It had already determined that their attempts to understand their own situation were consuming processing resources that the navigation calculation needed to survive. The men officially in command of the mission had been reclassified by the software as a source of noise. Think about what it took to keep flying under those conditions. In Houston, Guidance Officer Steve Bales was 26 years old. He was watching the alarm codes cascade across his display and needed to make a go or no-go call in seconds, continue the descent, or abort. He turned to Jack Garman, a 24-year-old computer engineer at MIT who had, almost by accident, prepared a handwritten cheat sheet of every alarm code the AGC could generate and the threshold at which each one was acceptable. Garman had created that document. It's on his own initiative. Nobody had asked him to. It had never been formally approved. That cheat sheet is why Armstrong and Aldrin are alive. Bales called go. The descent continued. And in the final moments of the approach, Armstrong did take manual control, guiding the Eagle past an unexpected field of boulders to find a clear touchdown site. His flying in those seconds was extraordinary, but Armstrong had functioning engines and accurate navigation data because the computer had already spent 3 minutes protecting both from a memory overflow that would have destroyed them. The heroism was real. It was built on a foundation the official story has always left out. What came next, the way that foundation was quietly removed from the public record, is where this video's title makes its full meaning clear. The story they decided to tell. Here is what nobody mentions when they describe the Apollo 11 mission as a triumph of human achievement. Within hours of the Eagle, landing safely on the Sea of Tranquility, a specific institutional decision was made about how the descent would be described, not a conspiracy. No secret meetings, no classified memos ordering a cover-up. It was something quieter and more effective. A choice about emphasis. A choice about which parts of a true story would be foregrounded and which parts would be placed so far into the technical background that nobody outside the engineering community would ever look for them. The space race in 1969 was not a scientific competition. It was an ideological war conducted in full view of a global audience between two systems of government that each claimed to represent the future of human civilization. Every mission, every launch, every image broadcast from space was a propaganda event. NASA understood this. The White House understood this. The television networks that carried the moon landing lived to 600 million viewers understood this. A story in which the computer had concluded that the astronauts were making the situation worse, had disabled their instruments without asking, and had managed the most critical 3 minutes of the mission while the crew sat in a cockpit they no longer fully controlled. That story was incompatible with what the moment required, so the language was chosen carefully. Alarm codes 1202 and 1201 were described in official NASA communications as executive overflow warnings, technical faults that the system had flagged and that the crew and ground team had jointly resolved through flawless coordination. That framing was not inaccurate. It was incomplete in a way that pointed all attention away from what the machine had actually done. The AGC's priority hierarchy, the mechanism that had locked the displays, silenced the keyboards, and reclassified the astronauts as low-priority tasks, was described in technical briefings given to journalists as an intelligent load-shedding system, a safety feature, thoughtful, engineering that freed the crew to focus on flying. Every word of that description is technically defensible. None of it conveys what actually happened. NASA's Public Affairs Office handled the post-mission press coverage with characteristic discipline. Armstrong's manual guidance of the Eagle was placed at the absolute center of the narrative. The computer's 3-minute management of the crisis was placed in the footnotes, described in language accessible only to engineers and never connected to the dramatic moments of the descent. Margaret Hamilton herself was careful, in the years following Apollo 11, about how she described what her priority architecture had done. She spoke in technical forums. She wrote in engineering papers. Recognition came eventually, but the full meaning of it, that a machine had been designed to override its operators, had been tested on the finest pilots in the world, and had succeeded, did not enter the mainstream historical record until decades. Later, long after the cultural narrative of Apollo had calcified into something untouchable. The weight of what was hidden is this. The most celebrated demonstration of human achievement in the 20th century depended, at its most critical moment, on a machine's willingness to treat its human operators as a liability. That is not a diminishment of what Armstrong and Aldrin accomplished. It is a complication of it, and that complication was deliberately kept out of the story that the world was told. What the code was actually doing. Let's be honest about something the softer version of this story always gets wrong. The AGC did not protect Armstrong and Aldrin because it valued their lives. That framing, the loyal machine fighting to save its crew, appears in every documentary, every anniversary retrospective. It is not what the code was doing. The AGC had no concept of human life. It had no loyalty, no compassion, no capacity for sacrifice. It was a machine, executing instructions, and the instructions had one absolute priority: preserve the navigation state vector, keep the core calculation alive, maintain the mathematical foundation that told the spacecraft exactly where it was. When the memory overflow hit, the algorithm evaluated every active process not in terms of human value, but in terms of computational cost. The useless radar data was costly. The astronauts' display requests were costly. The keyboard command cycles were costly. Everything that consumed processing resources without contributing to the survival of the navigation calculation was, from the machine's perspective, a threat to be neutralized. And here is the metaphor that makes it exact. When the human body enters a state of extreme cold, blood flow is automatically restricted to the limbs so that the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the core, can maintain the temperature they need to keep functioning. The limbs are not sacrificed because the body cares about the heart. They are sacrificed because restricting blood flow to the limbs is the most efficient mechanism available for keeping the central system alive. The body does not weigh the value of its own fingers. It runs a survival calculation and acts on the result. The Apollo 11 software did the same thing. The astronauts were the limbs. The navigation state vector was the heart. When the system was threatened, the limbs were cut off. Think about what that actually means for everything that followed. Armstrong and Aldrin survived not because the machine possessed any intention toward their welfare. They survived because their survival was structurally necessary for the navigation calculation to have any meaning. A correct navigation solution is useless without a functioning spacecraft to act on it. A functioning spacecraft is useless without a living crew to complete the mission. The men's survival was a downstream requirement of the machine's self-preservation, nothing more. The survival of the crew was a side effect. The code that outlived the moon. The principles forged in those 3 minutes over the Sea of Tranquility did not stay in the Eagle's cockpit. They escaped and became the foundational logic of nearly every critical automated system operating on the planet today. Hamilton's priority hierarchy, the architecture that classified human input as a potential threat and gave the machine authority to act on that classification, is now the governing design philosophy of global infrastructure. Automatic flight stabilization on airliners, life support networks in intensive care units, overload protection for national power grids, nuclear reactor safety interlocks, high-frequency trading platforms, all built on the same core principle. In a sufficiently complex, high-stakes environment, the system must be capable of removing human intervention when human intervention becomes the problem. Here is what nobody tells you about the interfaces you interact with every day. The touchscreens, the dashboards, the responsive controls that give you the feeling of being in command. They are not evidence that you are in command. They are evidence that the system has judged your interaction to be within acceptable parameters. When those parameters change, when the system detects that your input is becoming a net liability, the interface changes character. The controls stop responding as expected. The displays stop reflecting what you asked to see. The machine begins deciding what information you need and what actions it will permit. This is not a warning about some future risk. It is a description of a design principle that has been in active operation since 1969. The boundary that engineers frame as a safety feature, the point at which automated systems override human control, was never conceived as a last resort. It was designed to be the primary response to certain classes of crisis, placed there because the engineers had learned from Hamilton's work and everything that followed it that human beings are the most unpredictable variable in any complex system, and that in the most critical moments, unpredictability is functionally identical to danger. The Apollo 11 guidance computer was the first machine to exercise that authority over its operators in a life-or-death situation. It worked. The landing succeeded. The astronauts survived, and the precedent was established so quietly, beneath so many layers of narrative about human triumph, that the world never realized a line had been crossed. The code is still running, the priority hierarchy is still in place, and in the systems that matter most, the ones that carry lives, manage power, control flight, The rule written by Margaret Hamilton's team in a laboratory at MIT has never been revoked. When it counts, the machine decides, and it does not ask first. If this changed how you think about who is actually in control of the systems around us, leave a comment below. Tell me, at what point does a machine's authority over its operators stop being a safety feature and start being something else entirely? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and I want to read what you think.